All right, Numbers in the Bible, episode 8. We're going to cover a lot of tracks tonight. We're going to go through 23, 24, 20, 30, 40, 42, 50, 70, and 120. Now, we're going to hit some of those that are in between, but they only appear once or twice, so we're just going to mention them. A lot of the numbers just don't appear in the Bible, and so no way to tell what they mean when they do appear one or two times. I am Michael Pearl, and you are at the door, located in Lobaville, Tennessee. This is a ministry of No Greater Joy Ministries. We've covered 1, supremacy, or that which is unique apart from all others. 2 is the number of division in the Bible. 3 in the Bible is the number of divine control, election, sovereignty, evolution, ordering, or perfection. 4, number of wholeness in structure or nature, like the 4 legs on an animal or the 4 corners of the world, 4 parts of a building, 4 corners, a square with 4 corners. 5 is the number of divine appointment. 6 is the number of man, and 7 is the number of the program of God on behalf of man, like he made the Sabbath for man. 8 is the number of new beginnings. 9 is the number of termination or fulfillment, where 10 is the number of that which is whole, like the whole unit. 11 is the number of dissolution or incompleteness. 12 is the number of headship or rule, like government, like the 12 tribes, like the 12 apostles. 13 is the number of sin, death, and judgment in the Bible. 14 is the number of divine guidance and blessing. Notice the contrast in the different meanings of these numbers. And we'll find usually 85 to 95% of the times that that number appears, it carries these meanings. The number 15, which is it's a very positive number, and it's full of grace. 16 is the number of reigning or government, especially reigning. 17 is the number of reigning, but it's always negative. It's in a negative light, negative reigning. And then 18 is a number of oppression or judgment. 19 is the number of destruction, like annihilation. And 20, we covered last week, is the number of maturity. That's the point at which a human being reaches maturity. That would be 19 in our figuring, 20 in the way the Jews figured dates. So we come tonight to the number 21. It's only used once, so there's no way to tell for sure what it means. Now, if you look it up in a dictionary or a Bible dictionary or concordance, you may find it more than that, but those, if you look at it, it's part of a larger number. When we say 21 appears one time, we're talking about the ordinal 21. And 22 has 6 cardinals, no ordinals, all concerning reigning as well. There's no use in going into those. We'll just show you one for an example. Amon was 22 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 2 years in Jerusalem. Now that's pretty clearly about reigning, isn't it? Well, there's 5 more just like it, and that makes up the 6 that have to do with reigning. Then we come to the number 23. 3 cardinals, and it's also reigning, just very clearly. Won't go into them. I'll let you do that if you want to study it. And then 24 is chief representative. Now, I struggled to find a way to put that into words, and that's the closest I could get to it, a chief representative. It really would require a little more explanation, so we'll just look at some of those. The 11 cardinals, just 11 of them. Around about the throne were 24 seats. And upon the seats I saw 24 elders clothed, sitting in white raiment, and they had on their heads crowns of gold. There's 6 more just like that. So that makes 7 of them in all, 4 and 20 elders sitting on 4 and 20 seats. So you see the symbolism in it there. So we've got 24 elders, and you've got 2 times Goliath's fingers and toes, or 24 all total. He had 6 on each hand and foot. And then one time someone reigned 24 years, and one time there are 24 bullocks offered in sacrifice. So it's, in all cases, it's the representative. The 24 elders represent the church, the entire church, and Israel. And the Goliath represented the Philistines. And if he would defeat the man that Israel sent out, then all Israel would surrender to him. So he was their representative that day. And then, of course, reigning would be a representative. And the bullock there represented the one for whom it was offered, a sacrifice. So we have 26, it doesn't appear. 27 appears twice. Both times it speaks of provinces, 27 provinces. And then 28 appears 4 times. And again, they're varied, and so there's no way of knowing really what it means. And 29 appears just 4 times. So we won't struggle with those. And then we come to the number 30. It's got 79 cardinals and 1 ordinal. That's a whole lot more than the others, isn't it? So we can make something out of that, and we find its commencement. 30 is the number of commencement. What's commencement? That's the point at which something begins, the point at which it starts. And it's very bold about that. About half of the 80 references can be viewed as commencement readily. The other half are more varied and don't necessarily appear that way. So I'll have to say that God only used 50% of the time with 30 as commencement, and the other 30 just seem to be incidental. I mean, the other 40 just seem to be incidental or random. Maybe if we look at it closer, we would see something. Now, there's some patterns of 4 or 5 among those 40 that could mean one thing or the other, but I'm not interested in that. I want to know what the overall meaning of the number is. So let's open the Bible and look at some of those commencements. Notice this. From 30 years old and upward, even until 50 years old, all that enter into the host to do the work in the tabernacle of the congregation. You can absolutely see commencement there. Starting at 30 years of age, a man was old enough to become active as a priest in the temple. And he did so until he was 50 years old, at which point he retired. So that gave him just 20 years of active service in the priesthood. And that appears 7 times out of our 40. 30 years old and upward until 50 years old appears 7 times, all in reference to the priest. And then Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now, if you go back and put that in the context and read it, that's the point at which Joseph's ministry began on behalf of his people, so that he eventually brought them down to Egypt. So that's when he commenced his reign with Pharaoh. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plain of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses was ended. Now that's the point at which Moses died. He finished his work. He saw the promised land, but he was not allowed to go into it. He finished the 40-year job God gave him to do. And he goes up into the mountain, and that was the end of it. They commenced their journey into the promised land there. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. So that's the commencement of David's reign. You find often in the Bible that 30 is the age at which a priest or a king or someone begins their work. So 20 years old is just a little bit too self-possessed and arrogant. It takes a man to get to about 30 years old before he's humbled enough to take some kind of a leading role. And Jesus himself began to be about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, which was the son of Heli. So this is the last usage of 30, and so Jesus began his ministry at 30 years of age. Now, having looked at that, that lets you know why he waited till he's 30, because that was the proper age among the Hebrews to commence a priest, to commence his ministry. And John the Baptist also was 30 years of age when he began his. All right? Now we come to the number 40. Now this is a very obvious one, and I've never known any preacher or commentator that understood it differently from this. Everyone has agreed that 40 is a number of testing and probation. People who know nothing about numbers except that 13 is the number of sin, death, and judgment also know that 40 is the number of testing or probation. 95 cardinals and ordinals together. So let's look at a few of those. These are very significant. And yet 7 days I will cause it to rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living substance I've made will I destroy from off the face of the earth. So you see this time, this probation period, or this time that God has set aside, this special 40 span in which testing takes place. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian, Padanaram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. So he begins his life. If you read the story, you notice at the point that he took her is the point at which God begins to work with him and test him. And he goes through lots of testing. Remember what the Bible says? Jesus said, pray this, lead us not into temptation. Because God does lead us into temptation, not sexual impurity or desire to steal, but he leads us into the temptations, the trials, the difficulties, the burdens of life in order to test us, in order to perfect us. The trying of your faith works patience, and let patience have its perfect work. I'm starting to preach. Let me keep going with numbers. Genesis 50, and 40 days were fulfilled for him, and so are fulfilled the days of those which are embalmed, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. Joseph died, and the Egyptians mourned for him. After 40 days, he was embalmed, and they mourned for 40 long days. And the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years. So that 40 years was a time of testing for the children of Israel. And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and gat him up into the mountain, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. You see, those of you that read the Bible, you see this word 40 in these contexts repeatedly, and anytime you see it in a new passage you're not familiar with, you automatically can associate it with testing or trials, because you know that's the way the Bible uses it. And your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years and bear your whoredoms, and your carcass will be wasted in the wilderness. Then he says, when I was gone up into the mount to receive the tables of stone, even the tables of the covenant which the Lord made with you, and I abode in the mount 40 days and 40 nights, neither did eat bread or drink water. Certainly a time of testing, a probation period for him. 40 stripes he may give him and not exceed, lest if he should exceed, beat him above these with many stripes, then thy brother should seem vile unto thee. This is when Moses was giving from God the words God gave to him. He was imparting to Israel that in a court situation where a man did something worthy of punishment, he was not to be beaten with more than 40 stripes, because 40 was the point at which more than that, everybody would say this is just cruel and unusual punishment. I would think 4 or 5 would be pretty cruel, but 40 was the maximum. That's why the Jews reduced it to 39. They wanted to make sure they didn't transgress that 40. So they would give 40 minus 1, and that's how come Jesus got 39 stripes. Joshua 14, 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. I brought him word again as it was in my heart. Now that's 40 years old was he when Moses sent him. That's what Joshua says. And that was the beginning of a trial and a test for him, because he took over after Moses. And the land had rest 40 years, and Amthel, the son of Kenaz, died. Now that was a period of time in which God spared them. Before that, they were under bondage and persecution. After that, they were under bondage and persecution. So this was a probation period of 40 years that God allowed them. And the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of the Philistines 40 years. Again, a probation period, a period of testing. So for 40 years, they escaped the wrath of the Philistines, but after 40 years, they fell into their hands once again. And the Philistines drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. That's Goliath parading up and down, daring someone to come out and fight him. And he'd been doing that for 40 days when David showed up. So we know the testing period was over with. It was time for some things to change. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee." And he arose and he did eat and drank, and he went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. This is Elijah, fleeing for his life from Jezebel. And God gives him something to eat, and he was able to be sustained and have strength 40 days over what he ate. Now, God's got some pretty good food. If we get a hold of that, we'd have some real energy bars, wouldn't we? I'd hate to have to just eat every 40 days, so I like more of that. I like to eat more often than that. No foot of man shall pass through it, nor foot of beast shall pass through it, neither shall it be inhabited 40 years, talking about Egypt. And I'll make the land of Egypt desolate in the midst of the countries that are desolate, and her cities among the cities that are laid waste shall be desolate 40 years. And I'll scatter the Egyptians among the nations, and I'll disperse them through the countries. And this is exactly what he did. This was the prophecy. It was fulfilled. Thus saith the Lord God, at the end of 40 years will I gather the Egyptians from the people where they were scattered. And thus he did. So that was 40 years of testing for the nation of Egypt. And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." That was the probation period. If they had not repented after 40 days, they would have been killed. They did repent, and they were not destroyed. And when he fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was after it, hungered. That's Jesus. 40 days and 40 nights. That's a long time. To whom also he showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days. So between his resurrection and Pentecost, 40 days he was seen by up to 500 people at one time. So that was a period of probation. Of the Jews, 5 times received I 40 stripes, Paul said, save one. Testing, no doubt. Now we come to the number 42, and this just appears 7 times, but it's terminal judgment every single time that it appears. Terminal judgment, in other words, judgment that results in death. So we'll look at several of those. And among the cities which ye shall give unto the Levites, there shall be 6 cities for refuge, which ye shall appoint for the manslayer, that he may flee thither. To them he shall add 42 cities. So this is when someone had committed an act of not murder, but manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter. And they could be killed by the family members of the one that he killed, unless he fled to one of these cities. So his life was always in jeopardy. If he ever left that city boundary, they could catch him and put him to death. So there were 42 cities, and it had to do with terminal death. And he turned back and looked on them and cursed them in the name of the Lord. And there came forth 2 she-bears out of the wood and tare 42 children of them. Now, you know what happened there. They went out to Elisha and they said, "Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head." The children were mocking the prophet. And God sent bears, 2 of them, out of the woods and tore 42 children. That's a terrible story. 42 children. But notice the number 42. It's not 37. It's 42. Why? Terminal judgment. 42 years old was Azariah when he began to reign. Now, that's not what you think it is. Azariah, when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and the destruction of Azariah was of God by coming to Joram, whom the Lord had anointed to cut off the house of Ahab. So we're talking about terminal death here, 42 years. Revelation 11, but the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. So this is a prophecy of what's going to happen during the tribulation, when the holy city is going to be tread underfoot and Jews are going to be put to death wherever they're found, along with anyone else who doesn't have the mark of the beast, his number, or his name. 42 months, terminal judgment. Couldn't be any stronger than that. And here's the last one. There was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. That's Antichrist. Continues in killing off a great portion of the world's population, and he has 42 months to do it. Can you see how that 42 just crossed the board is terminal judgment? I find it fascinating that these numbers are used so consistently, with the Bible being written over a 1,600-year period by over 40 different men, writing in 3 different languages at least, and they all use numbers with the same symbolism all the way through. Now we come to the number 70, God's appointment to rule. 41 cardinals and ordinals together. 70 is found 41 times. 70 years is found 10 of those times, 10 of the 41, 70 years. 70 as a measurement of something is 15 times. And 70 as just different context, but it's always God's appointment, is another 16 times. And in that 16 times of God's appointment, there are 70 elders mentioned 6 different times, the number of man. So let's look at a few of those. And all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. Now this is the seed of the nation, these 70 souls. These are the ones God chose to create the Jewish race. And he said unto Moses, come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nabam and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship ye afar off. So 70 elders were appointed over the nation, and they were the rulers, the elders of the nation. So they're divinely appointed in that regard to hold office. There are 6 references just like this. We won't read any more of those. And thus God remembered the wickedness of Abimelech, which he did unto his father in slaying his 70 brethren. Now these 70 brethren were destined to rule, and by killing them he kept them from ruling. And Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria. And Jehu wrote letters and sent to Samaria unto the elders of Jezreel, to the elders, and the rest of the context says they slew these 70 sons who were destined to rule, to prevent them from ruling. And there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. And these 70 men of the ancients were also rulers in Israel. And then we read in Daniel 9, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Now we know that 70, again, has to do with this God's appointment to rule, destined to rule. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, upon the holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision, and to anoint the most holy. And when the most holy is anointed, he begins his millennial rule, 1,000 years long. After these things, the Lord anointed other 70 also, this is the early church, and sent them 2 and 2 before his face unto every city and place whither he himself would come. So there were 70 of the believers appointed to take the kingdom message to all of Israel. And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name. So they ruled over devils, and they rejoiced that they had that rule, these 70. Now, there's also 70 years, appears 10 times, And it has another shade of uniqueness. Do you remember the number 7 is that which God does for man? Okay, 70 is the program of God on behalf of the nations, or the rule on behalf of the nations. And very clearly, 8 out of 10 read this way. Jeremiah 25, and this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Can you see the appointment to rule right there? The appointment to rule. The first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereby the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. Those 70 years, they would be ruled by Babylon. God appointed Nebuchadnezzar to do that. And it shall come to pass in that day that Tyre shall be forgotten 70 years, according to the days of one king. At the end of 70 years shall Tyre sing as a harlot. And it shall come to pass after the end of 70 years that the Lord will visit Tyre, and she shall turn to her hire, and shall commit fornication with the kingdoms of the world upon the face of the earth. And God brings judgment and destroys Tyre, wipes it off the face of the earth forever at that point. 120 is our last number for this lesson. 120 now, it's a prominent number that sticks in the minds of Bible students. And it is, if I can find one word, it's sacred. It's hard to sometimes, there's a flavor. How would you describe flavors with one word, or colors with one word? But that's as close as I can get to it. And you'll catch the flavor as we read these 12 cardinals. 120. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. God announced the destruction of the earth by water, told Noah to build an ark to save the world, and he gave 120 years of life for everyone up on the face of the earth and every animal. At the end of that 120 years, everything would be destroyed. That was a sacred time period God set aside. And Moses went and spake these words unto all Israel. He said unto them, I am 120 years old this day. I can no longer go out and come in. Also the Lord has said unto me, thou shalt not go over this Jordan. So that was a sacred time. He died at 120 years of age. His life was divided into four 40-year periods. And each one of them was a period of testing. And the last one was the wilderness wanderings. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. It was sacred, that 120 years where God selected, chose him, and used him. And the sons of Korath, this is priestly, Uriel, the chief, and his brethren, 120. So these are priests assembled in the context to carry the Ark of the Covenant. And that was a sacred duty. The most sacred thing in Israel was the Ark of the Covenant. Also the Levites, which were the singers of them of Asaph and Heman and Jeduthun, with their sons and their brethren, being arrayed in white linen, having cymbals and psalteries and harps, stood at the east end of the altar, and with them 120 priests, sounding with trumpets. Now, don't you know that would be a lot of praise music, 120 priests. They weren't all just blowing, like calling up some dog or something. They were making music on these trumpets. So 120 of them, that was a sacred responsibility, a sacred duty. They were the praise and worship there in the temple, the 120 priests. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. You say, but that's a heathen king. How could that be? Well, look at it. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first. So Daniel was appointed to be over these 120 that were set aside by this man Darius, whom God brought to the kingdom. And so it was a sacred number of people. And in those days, Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples and said, the number of the names together were about 120. So that's the early church. That's the ones on whom the Spirit of God falls, and they began to preach on the day of Pentecost. So that's the seed for the church, 120, sacred seed. So putting it together, a grace period before the flood, 120. Gold in the temple, we didn't go into those, but the number of times it refers to the gold in the temple as 120 shekels or 120 pieces, 120 quite a few times in the temple. Number of priests were 120. Number of musicians in the temple was 120. The priest's sons are listed as 120. The height of the temple was 120 cubits. And the age of Moses, when he finished his ministry, was 120. And the number of the founding of the church were 120. Now, that's a summation of all of these passages on 120. Can you see how all of those are sacred things that God has set aside? And that is the end.